per usual. Great things to share today. I'm particularly excited about our speaker today. She happens to be a friend of mine. This
So your filter
is Rachel Douglas. She is from here in the Pacific Northwest. She's a board certified chaplain and trained death doula, working as a hospital chaplain at Evergreen Hospital up in Portland. She specializes in trauma-informed spiritual care and has experience in palliative care and hospice, behavioral health, and grief and bereavement. In her spare time, she loves taking walks around Seattle, West Seattle, reading and doing yoga. So Rachel is here to share with us a little bit. She was going to be here on the 26th of October, and then we had no power. So she very graciously altered her schedule to be here with us. But we are really excited. I think grief is something that impacts all of us, and some of it in traditional ways we expect, and other ways that it sneaks up on us. So I think this will be a great conversation, and I will hand it over to you.
It's so lovely to be here, and I also appreciate your flexibility on finding another time for me to be able to come here. Good morning to everybody, and I'm going to sneak over to the camera and say good morning to everybody joining us virtually as well. Hello! What I wanted to start with today is you probably saw these handouts. I don't know if any of you got a flashback to elementary school seeing the handout. I want you to know this is not required. I'm a big believer that we all are our own best experts in how we learn. And so I like to provide multiple avenues for us to learn well. So if you are somebody who likes to take notes, the front side of this handout has places that you can take notes. You can also just freestyle notes if you don't like the notes that I made for you. On the back, there is a coloring page. I know if you are anything like me, sometimes when my hands are occupied, I learn better. Kelly has graciously offered us some markers and crayons to facilitate the coloring if desired. Why don't I put one on this side and then one on this side? And feel free to just ask for your neighbors to pass down that bottle. If you decide you'd like to partake in the coloring, you can also partake in the coloring afterwards, if that works better. My final note, as my patients tell me probably 4 times a day, I have a very quiet voice. And that doesn't work for everybody, and I promise I do know how to project. I just need some reminders sometimes. So this is your permission to just go like this. Just put your hand up to your ear. This goes for you folks online too. You can just put your hand up to your ear if you can't hear me. And I can start to speak louder and enunciate better.
What, did you go to Princeton Seminary or something?
Well,
Goodness.
Where would I learn things like that? I just don't know. So what I'm going to be talking about today is grief and loss. So what I like to start out in talking about grief is, first of all, that I know it's personal. There's not a single one of us who gets out of life without going through some sort of grief. And I first want to acknowledge that as we talk about grief, it is likely that you will have something from your own life, your own experience, that kind of comes up to the surface as we talk. Know that you are not broken if this happens. This is in fact normal, and this is healthy, and it also hurts. And sometimes I think as a society, we don't acknowledge that sometimes things that are good and normal and healthy also hurt. So if there's tears, know that I'm a big fan of tears. One of my colleagues at Evergreen likes to say, if God didn't want us to cry, God wouldn't have given us tear ducts. So know that this is a welcome space for you to use that creation of God. So first we're going to talk about what is grief and bereavement. And I am going to just briefly, and I'll bring them back, I promise, but I just want to make sure I can see those notes. So what I'll be talking about initially is kind of demystifying some of these words we have around grief. So what is grief? What is bereavement? What is mourning? And why do we have 3 different words? I'm also going to talk about what some myths around grief are. Maybe what are some unspoken expectations that we bring to not only conversations about grief, but our own experience of grief and grieving. And then finally, I want to talk about our own experiences. What does my grief look like? How to show up when I'm in a space of grief? So first, when I talk about grief, I'm going to make a distinction you might have heard before, but this also might feel new. And that is this idea that grief is not an emotion. Here, we have some symptoms of grief, and they kind of range throughout the human experience. Sometimes there are cognitive symptoms of grief, so things like shock, numbness, brain fog, we call it grief brain when it's connected to symptoms of grief. Sometimes our memory doesn't work quite as well when we're in acute grief. You'll see that emotional is its own separate category. What is important about acknowledging that grief, while it is connected to our emotions, is not itself an emotion, is because when we start saying kind of grief is what I'm feeling, then it takes away our ability to actually go in and name the emotions we are experiencing in grief. Because as you can see from this list here, there isn't one emotion that encompasses all of grief. In fact, a part of the process of grieving is experiencing a wide variety of emotions. I think when a lot of us say I'm feeling grief, what we are often saying is I am feeling sad, or I am feeling lonely, maybe I am feeling despair. And I would encourage you, kind of when you are saying, yes, this is in the category of grief, that's important to acknowledge, but to also, the kind of term within psychology is emotional granularity. So being able to practice this idea of naming your specific experience, and this is going to be me jumping ahead a little bit. The benefit of having that emotional granularity is it means you also get to be present with yourself in particularity. It also means you get to ask for help in a way that's helpful. And that's it. But some kind of emotional aspects of grief that we have experienced, maybe fear or anxiety, panic, anger, irritability. There's sadness and numbness coming back, longing, helplessness, vulnerability, I think is a really big one. And there's also physical manifestations of grief. So something kind of when I'm in the hospital, kind of even before, if we've experienced, if we are anticipating a death or have experienced a death, or maybe a change in relationship, people will suddenly start to feel really, really tired, and they'll kind of sleep all day, and they won't quite know why. The opposite might happen, and they might feel exhausted but not be able to sleep and kind of start having insomnia. It's also really normal for there to be like muscular changes. So you might start, there's especially a lot of abdominal pain that can start to happen with grief. Or you kind of notice that your shoulders start moving up by your ears, and you don't really notice it until somebody points it out, and then you go, oh, that's where my shoulders live, more by my lungs versus my ears. Finally, there are spiritual and social changes in grief. So spiritual things like questioning our religious or spiritual beliefs. I think a really common one is, why is God doing this to me? why is God allowing you to go through this? Or maybe I often think of spiritual can be our relationship with God. It can also be our relationship with ourselves or our relationship with the people around us. So after going through this loss, who am I? That I maybe found a part of my identity in this relationship. And now I'm feeling kind of ungrounded or unmoored experiencing this loss. Another question being, am I really a good friend? Am I really a good husband, wife, or partner? Am I really a good kind of doubting our ability to fulfill our roles in relationships after experiencing loss? Social, I really love the way this put this. You're give a damn. You're just like, nothing really matters anymore. So why am I going to put effort into getting dressed in the morning? Why am I going to put effort into work? Why am I going to put effort into, reaching out to my family? You'll notice they also talk about things like you might do the opposite. You might notice with grief, there's a lot of the opposite ends of the spectrums. You might also start feeling too dependent on others. Like, I actually need the other people in my life to get up. You could be noticing yourself avoiding the people around you. And then finally, when it comes to family and work, you might become hypervigilant regarding your health and safety or the health and safety of the people that you love. You might find yourself distancing yourself from the people around you. You also might find the people around you who are also experiencing loss. And you could hear yourself saying, these seem like they're coping with this better than I am. Or maybe even, those people seem to be coping really badly, and I actually think I'm doing a really good job. You'll notice, as I talk about all of these, I'm not saying any of them are good, and I'm not saying any of them are bad. They simply are. When you think about your own experience of grief, and you look on this list, what I want you to do is I want you to look at this list, notice what's happening in yourself, and say to yourself, I am normal. I was talking a little bit at the beginning about how grief is both normal and it hurts. And there is nothing on this list I think that is pleasant. There is nothing on this list that I think embodies how we want our lives to be. So it is suffering, and it is not bad. It is a part of being human. Briefly, I do want to talk about two concepts about grief that are maybe outside what we would normally grief. First is this idea of anticipatory grief. So that is grief that happens prior to the actual loss. The only thing that makes anticipatory grief different than grief is that it happens before kind of what you would think of as the loss. I always like to think of anticipatory grief as protective. It's kind of a part of this fear anxiety category. It's a way that our nervous system and our body is trying to say, so if I go through this grief ahead of time, it's not going to hurt so much when it actually happens. I see a lot of nodding.
Oh, yeah.
And again, you'll notice that I don't say that that is good or that is bad. That simply is. I think I'm a big fan. I think Kennedy might have heard me say this a few times. I'm a big fan of emotions aren't bad. They are simply information. They are simply telling us where we are and what we are experiencing. And so if you're noticing that anticipatory grief come up, I would encourage you to kind of look into those places of fear or anxiety and just get this. Why that's coming up? What you'd like to protect yourself from.
Can I ask a quick question or just make a quick comment?
I heard somebody speak, but I couldn't hear you. So let me get a little closer so I can hear you.
If you could, there's a microphone on a table. If you could slide that more in front of you, we could hear you better on Zoom. I hear you
Is
good.
this
When you're
microphone?
talking,
No.
fine. That'd be helpful.
Oh,
Let's hear them better too.
that's a microphone.
I forgot about this part.
Thank you for speaking up.
Yeah, thank you.
If I talk this way, is that easier for you all to hear? Okay, beautiful. I really appreciate you speaking up and saying something.
I'll leave that right here.
All right, so next we're going to talk about complicated grief. Is this term complicated grief just by a show of hands? Something you all have heard of before? No. So I'd like to introduce it just as like a concept, but not something I want you to internalize. I think a lot of people hear me talk about complicated grief and they go, oh no, goes back to that, I'm broken, my grief is wrong. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth too about when we get into an area where we might want to start paying a little bit more attention to grief. But the short version of complicated grief is it's this idea of grief that is not moving forward, grief that continues to feel stuck. So a great example of complicated grief is somebody who continues to present as if they are in the acute stages of grief. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean when I say the acute stage of grief. So somebody who presents as if they're in the acute stage of grief, so like they are experiencing the first normal month or two of grief, more than 2 years after the loss. So I think a lot of people hear that, and the first thing they think is, oh no, I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, and I'm 3 years out from the loss, or I still am really trying to figure out what gives my life meaning, and it's been 5 years since the loss. That's not complicated grief. That again is a really normal, like we all move at our own pace when it comes to grief. Complicated grief is like you feel like you have been in the first month after a loss for years. This term often goes hand in hand with disenfranchised grief, which again I'll talk about in a little bit. But why I want to bring up this idea of complicated grief is because some of us do, for reasons outside of our control, experience really intense grief for a very long time. This is going to get a little bit to common types of grief. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this one next. So when we talk about timelines around grief, really that first month of grief tends to be the most intense experience of grief. That's when you're losing sleep. That's when you really just don't feel motivated to do anything, or maybe eat all of your meals, or you just kind of feel stuck in bed or stuck on the couch. And so these physical and emotional, spiritual symptoms of grief kind of are the most intense in that first month. When we then think about 6 months after the loss, that tends to be when, if you talk with like a medical or mental health professional, they'll tend to say, quote unquote, acute grief ends at about that 6-month mark. So I'm going to go back and re-emphasize that these are kind of general guidelines, and most of us have a little bit more nuanced relationship with how our grief happens. But when it comes to how do I function? How do I continue to move forward in my life after a loss? This 6-month mark is when we tend to observe people start being able to kind of go back to their normal day-to-day. They tend to be back into mostly normal sleeping patterns. They tend to be able to eat regular meals and find joy in going out with friends again and connect with their family. does not mean that grief is over. It just means they're kind of starting to get back into normal rhythms around grief. Finally, when you come to about 1 or 2 years, this is when most medical professionals or mental health professionals kind of have an expectation for what we call integration. When I say the word integration, I know that sounds like a very clinical word, but mostly what I mean when I say integration is this idea that we have been able to bring our experience of grief into who we are. So it's not something where we're saying, oh, I shouldn't have experienced that, or this experience of grief was wrong and bad, but to say, you know, I did lose my mom. I did lose my friend. I did experience a breakup. And I still know who I am, even with that loss in my life. So this is where I will briefly go back to common types of grief. I think most of us, when we talk about grief, we think about death and experiencing a death in our life. But that is, I think, a very limited definition of grief if we measure it against our actual lived experience. So this is what I am using as our standard, is the lived experience of people. Other situations in which you might experience grief are a terminal diagnosis, or maybe a life-changing disability. So in my role as hospital chaplain, I work a lot with our palliative care team. And oftentimes people meet with palliative care for the first time after they received a cancer diagnosis, or maybe they received some sort of cardiac diagnosis. That means they can't reliably walk anymore, or maybe they're going to be confined to a wheelchair now, or maybe they just got a diagnosis of dementia. And so now they're kind of having to change their idea about future look like. So diagnoses, whether they be terminal or just a chronic disability, are also situations in which we can experience grief, a change or loss of relationship. So again, this can mean loss as in death. This can also mean loss as in breakup. This could be divorce. This could be somebody was dating and then they broke up. It could also be a friendship breakup. This could also be, this person was really close in my life 2 years ago, and now they don't really talk to me. And I don't quite know why they don't talk to me anymore. Change or loss of worldview is another time when we experience grief. I think a really clear example of this is 9/11. That was, for many Americans, a situation in which our view of the world changed, our view of who we were in the world changed, and a lot of people experienced grief after that event. And then I talked a little bit about things like Alzheimer's, dementia, psychosis. So anytime where we have a mentation or memory change can also be a time in which we experience grief. Okay, so now we're back at the timelines. And I want to point out this picture that I have here. I'm going to talk about the 5 stages of grief for Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in just a minute. But I love this picture because I think a lot of us still expect ourselves, even if we like mentally know grief isn't linear, we kind of expect ourselves to go through this top picture, this early theories of grief, where we like have our initial loss, we have our initial bereavement period, and then we go through some denial. We kind of go through the denial and bargaining period. And then we kind of have this clean emotional pathway into acceptance. I don't know about you all, that has not been my experience of grief at any stage in my life. I would love it, it would be lovely. But this bottom picture is more what most of us experience. which we do have these components. We do have the sadness and the anger and the fear components. And then we do have these parts of kind of when I talk about integration, that has to do with these everyday tasks. You are able to readjust your life and adjust around it, starting to do social activities and friendships. But it's a lot more like a ball of yarn that you go through and you slowly untangle, and then you get to a knot and you're like trying to get the knot loose and you let the knot loose, and then you have to step back and give yourself a little room. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about bereavement and grief and mourning.
Excuse me, what was the first one?
Bereavement.
Bereavement.
So this is a little bit more of a define your terms. So when we talk about bereavement, what tends to be important about that word in particular is that bereavement is a time period. So talk about bereavement, it is usually the death and then the time period right after the death occurs. If you are connected with a program like hospice, this is the time period in which you'll be offered bereavement services. You're usually offered bereavement services for a year after the death. And then there's this expectation that after a year, everything is okay and you don't need bereavement services anymore. There is this time period where there's this acknowledgement that your life is different now, and it would be normal for you to want and benefit from more support in your bereavement period. Now, bereavement is different from grief. I like to talk about grief as a lifelong process. And so grief is going to happen in bereavement, but grief is going to continue beyond the kind of social recognition of the ways that your life has changed after loss. A part of the reason I like to define both of them is because a normal human thing is that when the people around us stop recognizing what we're experiencing, we can start to doubt whether we should be recognizing this as well. So bereavement, I always like to say, is about when the people around us are about on the same page as we are. And that's usually a part of grief, especially grief after death, is that there ends up being a loneliness that starts about a year, sometimes 6 months after a loss. We start carrying our grief on our own, where maybe the support you had in the first month or 2 months or 6 months kind of starts to fade away, and we start to feel a little lonelier. And this is also where shame can begin to creep in, kind of going back to those doubts of, well, the people around me seem to think I should be over it, so maybe I should be over it. In case you had any doubts as to where I fell on that, you don't need to be over it at any certain time. But this is something I hear over and over again from my patients and clients is, oh, I'm a year out, bereavement support stopped, so maybe I should be better. And better is something that we'll talk about in a little bit. Finally, there's this mourning. So mourning is our outward expression of our internal process of grief. I won't say a lot about mourning, but I do like to point out that mourning doesn't look the same for everyone. I'm going to tell a story about my dad, and I know he's okay to be telling the story. Last October, my grandma died, and my dad was her primary caretaker. And after she died, my dad went straight into manage the estate, clean the house, kind of organize all of the like trust and just went into all the practical tasks. And I remember having a conversation with my mom, and she was kind of, your dad isn't processing this very well. I haven't seen him cry. I haven't seen him, really do much acknowledgement of his mom's passing. And what I told her in response is, no, I know my dad is mourning because he is spending 80% of his time awake on my grandma.
I'm sorry, I have to leave.
That's okay. Okay, beautiful.
Yeah. You might want to just talk about people like me that just forgot everything.
That forgot everything.
Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah,
You're not alone.
Yeah.
it sounds like you have some company.
Well, I have also a right.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Okay. All right.
We'll see you soon anytime.
So this conversation with my mom and I kind of exemplified this idea that mourning is being tearful, and mourning is kind of being alone by yourself or being sad. And when I was talking with my mom, I said, no, I know my dad is mourning because he is spending almost all of his time awake trying to honor my grandma's memory. And he is doing that by being responsible. He is doing that by putting his time and attention. And that's a reasonable way we mourn as well. That some of us mourn by being tearful, some of us mourn by emotionally processing, some of us mourn by being in action, some of us mourn by this is the way I loved this person when they are alive. And this is the way I want to continue to love them even after they're no longer. So that's my note on mourning. It's not just about crying. There can be much more. So now I want to talk a little bit about myths of grief. So I think at this point, most people have heard about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of grief. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her book on death and dying, she was somebody who worked with people who had received terminal diagnoses and were anticipating their death. Them and their loved ones were doing the emotional work around anticipating a death and then experience the death after the terminal diagnosis. So in her work with these folks, she created this model of the 5 stages of grief. So this is the idea that your first stage is denial, so rejecting the reality. Your second is anger. So this isn't fair. How do I fix this? How do I punish the people around me for making this happen, or myself for making this happen? The third stage is bargaining. So how do I, whether it's asking God or the people around me to do something to make the situation change. The 4th stage is depression. So emotional shutdown, not getting out of bed, nothing matters anymore. And then the 5th stage is acceptance. So I like to think of acceptance as here it is what it is. And I might be feeling all sorts of ways about it, but my hands are open to this is what I have in front of me. So the 5 stages of grief, what was really beneficial about it is that it gave voice to the experience of grieving in a population that had mostly been ignored up until this point. So this is kind of going back to people and their spouses, usually were included in the studies, who were experiencing terminal diagnoses. But kind of up until this point, grief and bereavement was really about the survivors after the death. And so the kind of great void that Kubler-Ross filled was What about this anticipatory grief stage? What about thinking about the loss before it happens? There ended up being kind of two larger problems that arose from it. And neither of these were Kubler-Ross's fault. I think sometimes when we criticize a model, it can kind of turn into like, this person did it wrong. I don't think she did it wrong. I think she actually did such good work that resonated with so many people that people started applying it outside of the area in which it was actually developed, which is why you see a lot of people talk about Kubler-Ross in the bereavement period, which technically, not the context in which it was made. That said, there were some really important parts of the human experience she did capture, which is why it ends up being applied so widely. At the same time, there are parts of a grief experience, kind of depending on your situation, whether it's after a death, or maybe it's a loss of relationship, where some of these stages might not apply in the way they do grieving in anticipation of death after a terminal diagnosis. Finally, the way it's presented is very linear. It is you go from denial to anger to bargaining. And kind of like we were talking about before with that U-shaped picture, most of our experience is not linear. There's a lot of back and forth, and you get to acceptance, and you're like, woohoo, I'm at acceptance, I never have to go back. And then the next day you're at denial again. And that can kind of set up a context where people go, well, I was at acceptance, like, am I really not going to get better? They start getting hopeless, thinking, well, I thought I got there, and now I'm back. It can also set up an expectation that, like, you're going to regress, that, like, there's something wrong with you, or there's some kind of failure on your part for going back and forth between these stages, when again, most people do. So instead of the Kubler-Ross, or I'll say in addition to the Kubler-Ross model, I want to introduce to you this book called Grief is a Journey by Dr. Kenneth Doka. If you have one of these handouts, at the bottom, you'll notice I put 4 book recommendations for anyone who would like to read more about this. You'll notice Kubler-Ross is on there because, again, I think her work is fantastic. And I also think the work of these other authors are also fantastic and kind of give us a fuller picture around grief. So Grief is a Journey by Dr. Kenneth Doka is something that takes a lot wider range of grief than just people who are experiencing grief after a terminal diagnosis. And because of that, I like to use this model a little bit more in my own practice as a chaplain. So some of the core points of Grief is a Journey is going back to this idea that grief is not linear and you don't progress in grief. You don't get better as you move along the stages, but that grief is meant to be a little bit more of that yarn ball. Kenneth Doka also comes back to this idea of complicated grief. And so again, complicated grief being about the most intense stages of grief, extending for such a long time, it interferes with our ability to find joy in our life. Dr. Doka goes into 4 styles of grief. So again, instead of that linear, here's the way we all should be grieving, he talks a little bit more about ways we might experience or embody grief. So that starts with the heart grievers, the head grievers, the head and heart grievers, and the heart versus head grievers. So from the story of my dad, you might assume the head griever, and you would be correct. He was somebody who, in his experience of grief, wanted the list of things to do, and that is the way he processed his grief. was through going through the tasks to honor his mom. And so he has a specific kind of pathway in grief that would look differently than a heart griever would. That said, if you read the heart and head grief categories and you say, oh, I actually do a little bit of both of those, you might be a heart and head griever. So you might be somebody who benefits both from having practical tasks and thinking through things, as well as kind of being more emotionally expressive or doing things like journaling. Finally, there is also heart versus head grievers. You heard me say at the beginning, none of these are good nor bad. And I think this is the grief style that gets the most flack because there is some contention inherent in a head versus heart griever. So this is somebody who is maybe natural style of grieving is at conflict with the way a person thinks they should be grieving. So this could be somebody who maybe wants to be grieving in a heart way, but has internalized a message that you're too much, that you're a burden to the people around you, and you should actually be grieving in this more practical way. And so the person kind of starts to present in this mixed way, but there's a lot of internal strife that comes with the way they want to be processing their grief and the way they feel like they need to be processing their grief in order to be accepted by themselves or others. The opposite can also be true, where somebody might be a head griever, and for whatever reason, I will tell you some examples I have heard are, if you're not crying, you didn't really miss them, they weren't really important to you, or you're not really processing your loss, or you're repressed if you're not crying. And so again, when you start to internalize this shame and saying, well, I'm not grieving the way I should be grieving, so I'm going to try and force myself to grieve this way. And so I'm not actually getting to process my loss and the way that my body and my nervous system needs to. That's what creates this head versus heart style of grief. I will note about the head versus heart that because of that expression of shame, that expression of non-acceptance about your own style of grieving, that tends to lead you a little bit more into complicated grief. And that has to do with kind of the normal metabolizing of your emotions that happens in grief being stifled. That said, a lot of people who grew up with abuse, who grew up with trauma, who maybe have a different personality than their larger culture does, they might tend a little bit toward head versus heart. So that all to say, it's not your fault if this is your style of grieving. My encouragement to those people would be to kind of pay attention to what feels normal and natural to you, and to make a little bit and it's going to lead us to our final conversation, which is about our own grief. No, you're okay. Thank you for being here. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this term called alarmed aloneness. Some of my own training is in a communication style called nonviolent communication. And so this is a term that comes from nonviolent communication. And it is about this experience of feeling alone, but also unsafe. So for a lot of people, when we're in danger, we want to be alone because that feels safer. But if you're in this experience of alarmed aloneness, it's a feeling that I'm alone, I am unsafe, and I have nowhere to turn. And why I bring this up in the context of grief is because I think most people experience alarmed aloneness at some point in their grief process. So it's that I'm going through loss, but if I talk to this person about it, I'm going to be a burden. Or this person already has so much on their plate that I can't bring it up to them because I don't want to be one more thing on their plate. And we kind of inadvertently narrow down all of our supports, oftentimes trying to be loving, right? Like oftentimes trying to be a good friend or a good partner or a good family member. But even if we are trying to be good to the people around us, we end up minimizing the support we are willing to take in those moments. And so that leads to this state of alarmed aloneness, of I have nowhere to turn and I can't do this on my own. Since I brought up alarmed aloneness, I'm also going to give you what the solution to alarmed aloneness is. Yeah. Not going to leave you hanging there. And then that's this idea of self-compassion. Self-compassion.
Thank you.
So I get this term self-compassion from two psychologists. One is named Kristen Neff, and she is a research psychologist. If this is something that sounds interesting to you, both of these people have videos on YouTube. And the second person's name is Chris Germer, and he is a clinical psychologist. So Kristen Neff just does research, and then Chris Germer mostly sees patients. But both of them have partnered together to talk about this idea of self-compassion, which at its core is speaking to yourself the way in which you would speak to a good friend or a child. I don't know about you all, that's not my default operating. I tend to be somebody who is very self-critical. And kind of as you've heard the examples that I've given about self-talk during grief throughout this presentation, you'll notice that the core at a lot of those examples are the belief that I'm too much, the belief that I am broken somehow, I am wrong to feel what I'm feeling somehow. And so all of those things at the core are self-criticism. And I also would bet that if any of you heard your children or your friends talking to themselves about their grief in that way, you would immediately say, no, you are not a burden. You are not broken. I, in fact, love getting to bring you food. And just knowing that you're going to eat a nutritious meal brings me so much joy. Or, no, you're not too much. I actually really love being here with you in your hard moments because I want you to know that you're not alone. And so much, it's so often easier to talk to the people we love that way than it is to talk to ourselves in that way. I know, it's the worst. And so I want to bring up this idea of alarmed aloneness to give you an opportunity to notice when that kind of way of talking to yourself comes up. And then this idea of self-compassion, to know that there is a different way for you to be able to talk to yourself. I might also say that self-compassion, since we're in a church, is the way that God speaks to us in our grief. And sometimes when I don't have it in me to give myself gentleness and compassion, it can be a little bit of an easier spiritual practice to say, okay, God, can you tell me how you are feeling about me right now? Can you show me what your love looks for me right now? Because even though I'm a chaplain and I do this every day for work, that sure does not mean that I am gentle with myself in my own grief all of the time. And that is one of the beautiful things about prayer, is that we don't have to be perfect all of the time to receive God's love. Just in case you need a little gospel in your learning today. And then I'll briefly just talk about these last two aspects, which is asking for help, which I think for most people is terrifying. And then the second part of grief that is terrifying is when others don't get it. what I hear a lot, especially when it comes to bereavement, is that the people who are grieving, starting usually about a week after a loss happens, and then it kind of doesn't stop for as long as the grief happens, is they start hearing the people around them say, well, heaven needed another angel. Or, yeah, or,
Everything happens for a reason.
everything happens for a reason.
You're young.
Yes.
You'll
Yes, aren't you so lucky that this happened when you were young, so you didn't have more? And all of, right, like, I'm glad that there can be an acknowledgement that all that is gross. Right, like, it's gross and it's insensitive. And I can say too, as the person who is also the chaplain to the people who say those things, is usually they say that because they feel helpless. Because they don't know what to say to make it better. And to be fair, it's because there's nothing they can say to make it better. And so they kind of try to find this middle ground of like, how do I kind of be comforting and maybe alleviate some of the stress that I'm feeling and wanting this person to feel better. But they're also their own stress and sadness. And so they come out saying these really insensitive things. So I say all that to say, whenever people say these things to you, because they probably will, I hope you come back and think about, first of all, it's not anything that you're doing wrong. That has to do with them. And that maybe there can be a little moment of compassion for those people too. That I like to think of compassion, that can kind of be a two-way street. Yes, compassion for you, but also compassion for, you must be really overwhelmed right now. And you don't know what to say to me, and I don't know what to say to me either. And it is so much harder to be wordless than it is to kind of try and find that middle. That also doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It does. Right. So in my brain, and this always happens to me, I always talk more than I think I'm going to talk. I want to take a moment. What? I was going to say, I said 3 to 5 others, but in this room, we have just under 10, if my math is nothing, and it doesn't always math. If y'all are okay with it, maybe we can just do this together as a whole group. And I would love to hear your response to these questions. The first being, did you learn something new? Was there anything in this presentation that you just haven't heard before? Maybe that felt illuminating. It's also okay if it felt stressful or you felt frustrated by something you heard today. I want to hear that too. What surprised me? What am I feeling curious about? And then have I experienced judgments about my grief from myself or others? And how has that affected my grief? And then finally, if there's any forms of self-compassion that you would like to practice, and what kind of support would you need in order to do so? So I'm going to sit down. And you get to answer any of those questions that
Those people that you might.
Oh, thank you.
That's a great call.
Our friends online, we have your picture showing in the room, and I hope you feel welcome to unmute and also speak up if there's any of these questions you'd like to share with the group.
I got Mike was good.
Maybe just doing it to you.
I was surprised. The head and heart made sense for me. I've always wondered, and I think it's also circumstances too, that I reacted so differently to my dad's death, which was younger, and then my mom's death, where I did like your dad. It was, just barge ahead, and I've always felt guilty for not grieving her the same way I grieved my dad, So that surprised me, and so that was good.
I love that you point out that what age you were at and the context you were at changed the way that you grieve. Because I think any of us who experienced grief when we were young, especially when we were a child, of course we're going to grieve differently, especially if we had different things we could contribute. So as you're older and you maybe have more responsibility, or when you are the caregiver of somebody who dies, you're going to show up in your grief a little differently because you have a different context. You might maybe lean a little bit more into that head style of grief. You might start to do the head and heart kind of grieving as opposed to just the heart. Thank you.
I thought it was very helpful. The first thing you said, that grief is not an emotion,
Mm.
and that just the listing of all the different symptoms was very.
Were there any of those symptoms that you kind of recognized as you saw the list and went, oh, I experienced that, but I didn't connect it to being grief? Yeah, you did. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
I had a question.
Yeah, that didn't need to. There was no need for grief. I mean, literally, he went to sea for a living, and he said, "There's never a reason, even a death in the family, is not a reason to get off the ship." So it made it hard, really hard for me when my parents died. I felt like I just didn't have any support. How am I gonna? I had to rely on close friends to take care of my kids while I went to the memorial service. It's hard. There's a lot of interference with your grief, and so I carried a lot of that for a while. Just it felt like I didn't get to do that.
It can end up being grief about your inability to grieve, that it kind of stacks on top of each other. And so suddenly you have to first grieve that you couldn't grieve the way you wanted. And then you have to go back and grieve the thing that you're grieving. And it kind of gets back to that yarn ball. How do I untangle this? And where am I in the untangling of this?
And the other thing that happens is helping your friends help you grieve.
Yes.
And just kind of being pretty transparent about, what you need. And, I don't have the energy to take care of your emotions right now. Just say what you want to say and love me. It just gets really tangled. There's a lot of tangling that goes on.
So much tangling. And I love that you said because I think this is something we've all experienced in grief. I don't have it in me to sort through your emotions right now. That's a part of that exhaustion. And also, I hope that is an invitation to the blessing of clarity, to say just like how I said at the beginning of this time together, you're the best expert on your learning. You're also the best expert on your grieving. And so there are going to be some people who want their friends to sit and listen to them. There are going to be some people, I'll name myself in this category. When I am grieving, I want people to be near me. And I want them to not talk to me. That I will talk to you when I'm ready to talk to you. And I'm going to sit here and bake or paint or whatever I'm doing. But I just want a safe person near me without the pressure of having to like perform my emotions for them. I also think, was it Mike that you were piping in to say something?
Yeah, one of the stumbling blocks for me is kind of on the opposite side. You know someone who's grieving, but you don't know how to approach that, or approach them, or so I've kind of looked into this and a little bit, but one of the slides you had earlier said that one of the things is people seem to avoid people that are grieving, and I think it's because you just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And that's very awkward, and it's not helpful, I don't think, to the grieving person, but I think a lot of us just don't know how to approach a grieving person and what to offer them. You think, well, maybe I should leave them alone, or maybe I shouldn't bother them, type of thing. Do you have any comments on that?
That kind of goes back to that vulnerability that other people and we experience when we are in the presence of somebody who is grieving. That, like, I don't want to make this worse, but I don't know how to make it better. And that sometimes when we start from the assumption that, like, I can't make this better, this is grief. So let me just take the pressure off of myself to think that I'm going to have the words that make them feel better, or that I'm going to be able to offer the thing that makes them feel loved right now. And to just say, grief sucks and nothing is going to make this better. I remember when I was in my chaplain residency, one of the palliative care social workers that I worked with, she had told me to never say, just let me know what you need, or whatever you need, just tell me. Because when you're grieving and you don't have the capacity to do the emotion stuff, it can often feel like an extra burden to say, you tell me what you need. And to instead say, I can drop off some dinner for you Monday night. I could come over on Saturday and help you clean your house, or I can help drive you somewhere this week. Which one of those would you like me to do? Yeah. And that when you do a little bit of the work to say, hey, here's what I'm comfortable doing. Because I think sometimes too, there can be a like, what if they ask me to do something I don't actually want to do? And so this is a middle ground of like, you get to say what you're willing to do, and then to give them one or two options. I'm the person that is like, let me bring you food. Or like, another thing I will sometimes offer too is like, do you want to go on a walk? Like, do you want me to come over on Friday and we can just go on a walk for a little bit? And then when you give people offers like that, they can kind of start thinking, I'm actually really good on food, but I'd really like for somebody to drive with me to the bank when I give the bank this death certificate. That can kind of open up a conversation about, oh, I actually have these needs met, but I don't have these needs met, and I would actually really like somebody to be here for me in this way. And that's something too that can be done in a practice of prayer. That like you can kind of sit back and pray with God and say, what am I willing to give right now? Because maybe I don't want to cook for somebody right now, but I would be really happy to go over and clean their kitchen, or I would be really happy to run an errand for them so that they don't have to run to the grocery store with their mascara smudged down their face.
That's, I think, some practical work the church could do. Even, I think that's some practical work the church, church can do. From either deacons, being aware of how to offer specific kinds of help versus whatever you need, I'm here. And maybe from the pulpit at some point too, It's just educating people about how to be I don't want to say effective, but be good at offering help in a way that doesn't put that burden on the person.
I like to think of it as considerate.
Yes, that is.
You know, that like that there's an awareness of you're exhausted right now, and I'm not exhausted. And so here's how I can show up. And it can totally be a thing the church does. It can also totally be a thing that kind of communities within the church come in and say,
Teaching people who then teach other people, like
Yeah.
a way that's
Yeah.
education or, community, society, whatever.
I think most of us, when we want to do a ministry, especially when we want to do a ministry around something like grief, we've got some personal experience about what works and what doesn't work. And I think to acknowledge that longing within yourself to do it well, not to, take on Kelly's job here, but that might be a really great sign of some of the ministry and mission that you're called to, some of the leadership that you might be able to bring to the church.
Coming out with me in death all the time.
I think that's a wonderful suggestion. I mean, my inclination if somebody dies is to go right to the kitchen and make something. And I think that for people who, for instance, people coming from out of town, so and so, it's nice to have a bunch of food. But the idea of, and maybe that's the first thing, that's done. But the idea of, after all, later on, offering specific things, because maybe the person who's in grief doesn't have they're spending, they don't even know what they need. Or let alone be able to discriminate, this would be better for me right now.
Yeah.
And here's somebody offering to do this. I love that. I never thought about that. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. I'll tell you one of my own practices too, is I will often not ask people immediately after a death what they need. I will also the month mark and ask then and say, hey, I know a lot of support you had in the last few weeks is starting to taper off, and you probably still don't have the energy to cook. Let me bring you a casserole.
Yeah, I've known a lot of people who've gotten in car accidents after death because
Yes.
and offering people rides to be with them and to ride there when they get out of that sort of zoned out.
Yeah. Back to that brain that you just don't process as quickly when you're in that stage. And it can lead people to getting into car accidents. It can lead into people falling, that they might be on the stairs and their brain isn't quite registering depth perception in the same way. There's something we will talk about at the hospital, that it's not uncommon when one spouse dies for the other spouse to die within 6 months. Some of that is spiritual. Some of that is also, again, that 6 month time period is the acute grief period. And so that sometimes like physical health becomes more fragile. There's some studies done about how the immune system weakens when we're in grief. So there are very kind of literal effects on our health when we do grieve. And to be able to have some mindfulness around, hey, I know you're grieving, and so can I drive you to your next doctor's appointment so that you don't have to worry about that? Or can I help you set up your bed in your living room so that you don't have to walk up and down the stairs for the next few months? And again, these are often what can be really helpful is always done best in conversation with the person who is grieving, and that sometimes it takes a little bit of time for that person to be in the place to be able to say, oh, I think this would actually be really good for me right now. And that's okay. It takes a little bit of practice to be able to be present with people and reminding yourself you can't fix it and you're not here to fix it. You can't save them. Our only savior is Jesus. And how can your presence still be a healing, loving presence for them? Well, I know we are a little over time, and so I will say thank you all for your patience with me as I talked more than I thought I would, and for your presence and thoughtfulness with me this morning. I'm so grateful to be able to be here.
Also, it's gonna wrap us up next Sunday, and hopefully, even as we've been talking about grief today, the point is to be able to talk about our emotions so that they seem a little less scary, and maybe we realize we are less alone than we convince ourselves that we are. So we're going to keep doing this good work. For those who were abundantly excited for today class, we are going to do that in January. And I will make sure everyone knows and looks forward to that as well. But lots of tools and lots of community, which is a great for us. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Rachel, and we will see you again soon.